One of my core beliefs when it comes to running Dungeons and Dragons games is that the classes the characters choose should impact the stories they experience. Today, in this video, I'm going to talk about how to cater your storytelling to rogues. Hi, I'm Jeremy. Welcome back to Experience Gain. For those of you who don't know, I write and publish Dungeons and Dragons related content over on the Dungeon Masters Guild, and just recently I released a product called the Rogues Gallery. It's a set of 8 new subclasses for the Rogue class. I'm really proud of the work I did with my editor on that project. I think the subclasses that we developed are both mechanically interesting and thematically unique, and I'd love for you to check them out. They're all linked in the description below, and I'll be mentioning some of the subclasses over the course of this video when talking about how to engage your rogue characters narratively all the way from character creation onward. So, of course, everything starts with character creation. This is where you can really lay the groundwork for all the possible stories that you can tell with your rogue character in the future. I think the first place to really start from, the first question to ask your player, is to determine where did your rogue come by their skills? How did they learn what they know? The background that the player chooses can have a big impact on this. If they pick a soldier background, did they learn to be a rogue through their soldier work? Were they part of some sort of special unit where those skills were necessary? Or were they independent? Were they criminals? I think that's a common direction that rogues go. But rogues don't have to be just that. They can be thrill hunters and treasure seekers. And I think if you're able to work with your player to connect the skills that their class gives them with the context of the background they choose, they're already going to have a much richer character backstory, and you're going to have a much more interesting and unique character story to work into your campaign. Or at the very least, you'll have more original hooks to lay in so that your campaign is more unique. Now, as part of this, I think it's always interesting to ask, were they taught by someone? This gives you immediately an NPC that can be part of an organization that the rogue was affiliated to, or independent. This ties into the idea of having adversaries and benefactors. In Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Wizards of the Coast introduced a whole section in the rogue subclasses all about introducing adversaries and benefactors that were connected to rogue characters. I think those are a great starting point. I think the best way to connect a character to something else in the world is through an NPC. We relate much more easily to people than we do to organizations. So if your rogue was part of a criminal group, think about who they interacted with in there. Did they have a rival? Did they have a best friend? Did they have a mentor? A harsh teacher? Once you introduce one person, it's a lot easier to spill out and introduce more, but don't go overboard here. In all likelihood, unless you're playing a solo one-on-one campaign, you're probably not going to address everyone they knew, and that stuff can always just be kind of hand-waved later on. What's really important is to have that one interesting character that they're connected to, that they know about, so that you can drop small hints along the way, or you can put them in a position of peril to encourage your character to go over in that direction, or so you just get that moment of recognition when that character comes back through the door. Whether you decide to make this NPC an adversary or a benefactor, someone who's on their side, you should also think about how that NPC is going to relate to the rest of the party. Obviously, their strongest relationship is going to be with the rogue character in question. But these adversary or benefactor NPCs are great candidates for group patrons. Through the connection that they share with this rogue character, perhaps the benefactor, the old mentor that the rogue was trained under, can hire the group for a job. Or perhaps in their efforts to get revenge on the rogue, the rival that they once had becomes a major rival to the entire party. This is another layer of security to ensure that all the players at the table don't disengage when it's not their story. They're all adventuring together, so each of their personal stories should be impacting one another. Perhaps the rival, at some point, captures another party member to get under the rogue's skin and put them in a difficult position. Now the character is much more real, and not just real to the rogue character that they're initially connected to, but to the rest of the party as well. The other element that Xanathar's Guide to Everything talks about is guilty pleasures. I think these are a great jumping off point. Rogues are very much prone to the darker side of life in Dungeons & Dragons, being involved with crime or other underworld type activities, so giving them some sort of vice is an interesting way to flesh out their characterization. And if you know that the player playing the character is going to be really good about role-playing not just the strength of the character, but also the flaws, that gives you plenty of opportunities to introduce story hooks along the way that you know the rogue character will either bite onto or at the very least be interested by. Some of the vices you could choose, for example, are pride, greed, or even sloth. Greed could very easily be addiction, whereas pride could be about one-upsmanship and making sure that in every town they go to, they are known as the best rogue around. Now you know that in certain towns, if you want to prepare and make sure there is something for the rogue, you can introduce some elements of gambling, whether it's as simple as a table in a tavern or a more elaborate plot. And you can prep to have other new rivals or allies potentially pop up through the rogue's efforts to establish themselves as the best and most capable thief or assassin or even potentially sharpshooter if you're pulling from my rogue subclasses around. Now, take these three different pieces that are all part of character creation. You have the question of how did the rogue come by their skills? You have the connection to an NPC, either an adversary or a benefactor, and then 3, you have some sort of vice or some sort of additional layer of motivation that doesn't have to be inherently related to the rogue's skills, but still gives them a bit more weight and a bit more realism in terms of fleshing out their character beyond a single dimension. The 4th piece is really just an expansion on all the things before, and it's specializing by subclass. If I had both a thief rogue and an assassin rogue in my party, I'd treat them both very differently, and I'd make sure that they encountered stories that were unique to each of them. If you take the arcane trickster, for example, you might want to tie the arcane into their patron or benefactor. Or perhaps their vice of greed is instead linked to knowledge and a desire to learn new spells. And now when they're running around different towns and running around the setting, it's not just about them encountering criminal groups, they can also encounter arcane groups and have a lot of interest there. The richness that the archetypes provide, I think, is one of the greatest strengths of the rogue class in general. I think they have some of the most interesting archetypes out of all the classes out there, and that's a big part of the reason why I decided to go ahead and create Rogues Gallery. There's 8 subclasses in there, and I'm really proud of all of them, and I think each of them adds a lot of richness to an individual character and can add a lot of richness to your game if you're willing as a dungeon master to do that little bit of extra work to personalize the elements that the characters encounter. For example, there's the Godsworn Rogue, who, unlike the Arcane Trickster, who specializes in arcane magic, the Godsworn specializes in divine magic. And now you can tie in religious orders and churches or their deity. Perhaps the rogue is on the outs with their order, and they're following maybe a different path than the established normal order. Or perhaps they're working for the church in a more underhanded and subtle way as one of their divine messengers or assassins, taking out enemies of the faith. The Saboteur also has its own speciality in crafting explosives. And now, along the way, you can introduce other tinkerers, other inventors, other opportunities for that character to expand upon their explosives. So make sure not to neglect one of the greatest strengths of the rogue class, which is the variety and theming of the individual subclasses. They're all so interesting, and that takes you all the way right up through character creation. And honestly, a lot of the character creation stuff you can do retroactively. It doesn't matter if the campaign's already underway. Most players are going to be totally open to taking a second to flesh out some additional backstory along the way that they didn't do when you first got started. In fact, the further along you are with your campaign, the better it is to probably do that if you didn't do it up front. Now, in the second part of this video, we're going to talk about how to engage your player, your rogue character player, at the table. One of the great aspects about rogues is that as a dungeon master, I think they're actually a little bit easier in some ways to DM than the other classes. That's because they are, in a lot of ways, naturally exceptional via the game's own mechanics. The skills that they get, like expertise, the fact that they have such a clear and established role in the party, often used to detect traps or disable them or pick locked doors, means that there are plenty of opportunities where they can shine. And when they get to embrace those opportunities, they really shine. Which means that in a normal session, if you're trying to spread the spotlight around to your various players, rogues are actually usually pretty good at stealing the spotlight for themselves from time to time. And honestly, that's great. That's a little bit less work for you to do. What you have to keep in mind, though, is not to punish your player for that. And that might sound really obvious, but I think it's actually kind of counterintuitive. A lot of DMs get into this antagonistic relationship with their players, where even if we all know that we're playing collaboratively, the DMs still want to make things a challenge. And that's a totally fair and right instinct. I enjoy challenging my players, and my players enjoy being challenged and succeeding. even if failure, I think, is a very interesting part of games. But when it comes to rogues, they tend to do so well that I think some dungeon masters can have this instinct, and I've had it from time to time, of trying to artificially inflate the difficulty so that they can't just succeed at everything that they do. And that, I think, is actually very unfair to your player. Your player has decided to build this character, and this is what their character is good at. For example, from my project Rogues Gallery, one of the subclasses I created is the Blade Master. The Blade Master takes the cunning that rogues typically apply to stealth and subterfuge and instead applies it to battle. They are incredible swordsmen, so let them be incredible swordsmen. If they miss an attack, don't narrate them as overextending or failing at what they're doing. And don't just challenge them with better weapon masters. Allow them to feel great. Allow them to really shine in the way they've made their character to be. The Phantom Blade is another example from Rogues Gallery. They take the idea of a rogue being able to use the blink spell to move in and out of the ethereal plane and push it to its fullest potential. This makes them incredible spies and scouts. And I know that scouting can be something that's really frustrating for DMs to deal with when players can harmlessly see what lies ahead, but there's always a risk, there's always ways to make that interesting, and if the players have invested in being able to scout out situations, let them. It'll change how they play the game, and there's other ways to surprise them. Don't feel cheated just because your players have decided to engage with that aspect of the game. Focus instead on reacting to your players' actions, and embrace the times when players use the skills that their characters are best at. If you want to give them a challenge, make it more about time. Instead of having one very difficult lock that they just need to roll a 25 or 30 to break, maybe give them a series of 4 locks with a trap built into it. Something that really plays to their strengths but is achievable. It raises the stakes for them, and it means that the rest of the party needs to potentially watch out or hold off enemies while the rogue makes it through this trap. Now you're not punishing them for their skill, you're creating a dramatically exciting and interesting scene around what they're doing. This really touches on a general rule which I think is really helpful to remember as a dungeon master, which is that for the most part, you should be challenging your players where they're weak, and let their advantages be just that. Let them be advantages. If you have a party that's not really magically adept, come at them with spellcasters. They're gonna feel the pain, I promise. If, on the other hand, they are playing all spellcasters, for example, and you just keep coming at them with other spellcasters that are somehow better and stronger, they're not going to feel really good about that unless it's really specifically the intent of the campaign you're playing. And honestly, that's something you should use sparingly. It'll be interesting if occasionally they meet a spellcaster that's much stronger than them, who can either be a big bad or a benefactor. You can take that lesson and apply it directly to rogues. Your rogue is supposed to be sneaky and cunning, or however the player at your table plays them. Don't just keep showing them up with sneakier, more cunning characters. Allow them to be the sneakiest person in the room the vast majority of the time. And then when you do introduce someone who's as good, if not better than them, it's going to have a much greater impact. Now, yes, all of this is a bit more work, but the more you do it, the easier you'll be at improvising these things along the way. It really does get easier, trust me. And like with all the other classes, what you want to do is try to create unique challenges for your rogue to encounter along the course of an adventure. These challenges should never be the only way forward. If your players are trying to track down an important person, whether it's an enemy or a friend, the rogue might have access to a whole criminal network that they could potentially use for this. That's a great direction to explore and can be really interesting, but it shouldn't be the only way forward. The 3 clues rule says that you should generally have, and this is kind of a reduced version, you should generally have at least 3 clues that point to your destination. So make sure you've at least considered 3 different paths your players could take to accomplish the goal that is set out for them or the goal that they've set out for themselves. Most of the time, they'll come up with something completely different and surprise you, and you'll be forced to react and adjust. But the prep you've done can be reutilized later or integrated into the solutions that they come up with. So, don't punish rogues for the things that they're already good at. Don't punish any players for the things their characters are good at. Create distinct challenges that cater to their skill set and raise the stakes and add drama for the entire party. So that's the first 2 points, which brings me to my next point. Integrate Thieves' Cant into your games. I'm not going to do a whole video about it. Dale Kingsmill has a really great video about Thieves' Cant that I highly recommend you using. I'll link that below as well. Check it out. It's really, really good. And Thieves' Cant is such an interesting aspect of the game that, like the Druidic language that I talked about in my Druid video, which Dale also has a really good video about, it can add a lot of richness to your games, to those characters specifically, by being something that only they can really engage with or do. So I'll skip the point of Thieves' Cant. Go watch Dale's video. She'll teach you everything you need to know about it. I'm going to keep moving on to reputation. Reputation is my last and final point on engaging your players at the table. The things before will cover 90% of your situations. Reputation is a whole other realm that I think can be really interesting if your player is interested in that. It won't be right for every rogue character, but it can be really meaningful, really impactful, and really engaging for a player who's into it. Reputation is simple. It's exactly what I was saying before. Rogues are supposed to be some of the best at what they do. There aren't going to be a lot of people who are able to be as good as them at those things. Not just amongst your party, but in the world as well. The reputation a rogue has can be not only a major tool, but an interesting narrative aspect of their character. And that reputation can either extend to the public, or it can be restrained to the limited circles that rogues typically spend their time. A master thief might be well known among the roguish communities, but not as well known to the public, for example. If you wanted to take a thief in the public direction, maybe they have a calling card that they leave behind at the scene of a crime. What an interesting aspect for a character to play with. Hopefully you can immediately see how that would lead to exciting narrative opportunities. Maybe there's somebody, a bounty hunter, who's trying to track them down. Maybe there's a rival thief that they're always trying to one-up each other. Maybe there's a patron who reaches out because they know that this thief is the best. And maybe that patron wants to frame them for a crime. On the other side of things, the Predator rogue from Rogue's Gallery is a rogue that uses their skills at instilling fear and tracking down prey to hunt down targets. They make incredible bounty hunters. So let their reputation grow as they gain in level and as they encounter more people and accomplish jobs. Generally, I think it's totally fine to conflate the reputation of the party with the reputation of the character, as long as you ensure that each character still has their moments of individual repute and individual success. With predators being so good at hunting down elusive targets, that can also bring a ton of opportunities. For example, job opportunities that will engage not only the rogue, but the entire party. It just allows the rogue to, in those instances, be the point of contact, even if they're not the standard face character of the group, the character that typically interacts with NPCs. After all, why would a group of criminals want to interact with the party's cleric, for example? The cleric might be the de facto spokesperson for the group, but if they relate more to the rogue's skills, they're going to want to talk to the rogue instead. Let that be the case. They are appropriate to the context of the situations you're trying to place them in, the situations you're trying to make feel real and engaging and interesting. And if that's what you're making your decisions by, you're in a pretty good spot. Always make the more narratively interesting choice, as long as it's not taking away from player agency. And the best way to do that is through studying the class that your players are playing and understanding how they view their own characters. What are they good at? What are they bad at? And what connections do they have to the world that they're adventuring in? Hopefully this video was helpful. I know we covered a lot in a short time, hopefully a more condensed time. I'm still doing my best to keep making these videos and to also keep making more Dungeons & Dragons content. If you want to check out the Rogues Gallery project, I would really appreciate it. It would mean a lot. I'm really proud of the subclasses that I put in there. There's a whole bunch I didn't cover: the Devilbound, the Sharpshooter, the Thug. I think they're all really, really interesting and exciting, both mechanically and narratively, like I said at the top of the video. So again, I linked it in the description. If you dug what I had to say and want to play some of these subclasses, head on over to the GM's Guild and pick up the project. And even if you don't, I hope you continue to tell better stories at the table with your friends and have a great time playing Dungeons & Dragons. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.